Rick stared at the glowing console in his ship's command chamber, his appendages curling in contemplation. The display was a cacophony of data, images, and telemetry gathered from countless galactic probes sent to the notorious Class 13 planet, Karak 5. Few dared approach it, let alone land, but Rick wasn't like most Evolians. For centuries, his kind had prided themselves on their meticulous and calculated mastery of existence. They thrived on harmony, control, and predictability. The chaos of Karak 5 was the antithesis of everything the Evolians valued. It was a world where no simulation could account for the sheer randomness of its fury. Rick's mission was unprecedented: to make contact with the rumored sapient inhabitants of Karak 5. At first, the reports had been dismissed as sensor glitches or the remnants of a failed colony. Yet the probes consistently returned anomaly structures, patterns of movement, and even thermal signatures resembling intelligent life. He adjusted his environmental suit and made final preparations for descent. The Evolian High Council had warned him against the expedition, but Rick couldn't resist the challenge. The idea that intelligent life could thrive on such a hostile world was both terrifying and exhilarating. The ship's landing sequence began, and the cabin shuddered violently as it breached Karak 5's turbulent atmosphere. Outside, the world was a swirling maelstrom of chaos. Towering storm clouds painted the sky in hues of sulfurous yellow and blood red. Lightning arced horizontally, splitting the horizon with deafening cracks. The ground below was a jagged tapestry of molten rivers, crystalline spires, and sprawling jungle-like vegetation that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. Atmospheric density at 231% of Evolian standard, the ship's AI announced. Caution advised. Rick clutched the console, his appendages trembling slightly. Caution noted, he muttered, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his unease. As the ship's landing struts touched the surface, a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. The moment he had anticipated for months was here. The ramp hissed open, and an unfiltered wave of heat and dense air swept into the cabin. Rick's protective suit adjusted automatically, its filters and cooling systems working overtime to maintain stability. He stepped out, his 6 eyes scanning the alien landscape. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The air smelled of metallic tang and sulfur, and every surface seemed alive, vibrating, shifting, or emitting faint luminescence. This was nature at its rawest, untamed and unapologetically lethal. But the most surprising thing wasn't the landscape. It was the figure walking toward him. The being was humanoid, its form matching descriptions from the ancient Earth data files in the Federation's archives. But this wasn't the frail, hairless biped he had read about. This human seemed unnervingly at ease, navigating the unstable terrain with an effortless grace. The human's clothing was puzzling: a loose, sleeveless shirt, sturdy pants, and boots that looked cobbled together from various materials. Most bewildering of all, the human was holding a steaming cup in one hand, waving casually with the other. "Hey there, alien dude," the human called out, their voice lighthearted and carefree. Rick froze mid-step. His translator Chip struggled for a moment before interpreting the words. "Greetings, you are sapient." The human laughed, their expression amused. "Well, I like to think so. Name's Dan. Welcome to Karak 5. Dan's relaxed demeanor was jarring. Rick's sensors were blaring warnings of extreme radiation levels, toxic atmospheric gases, and seismic instability. Yet this human seemed unperturbed, as though strolling through a meadow on a temperate Class 4 planet. "You are unprotected," Rick said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "The atmosphere here is toxic by most standards. The temperature alone." Dan cut him off with a chuckle. "Nah, it's not so bad. You get used to it. Besides, I've got my coffee. Keeps me sharp." Rick stared at the steaming cup, his appendages twitching. "You ingest heated organic acids?" "Yep, you want some?" "No," Rick exclaimed, taking an instinctive step back. "That could dissolve my internal organs." Dan shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Suit yourself." Dan led Veyrick to what he called his camp. As they walked, Veyrick's sensors cataloged countless hazards: unstable ground, patches of bioluminescent moss emitting high-frequency radiation, and clusters of insect-like creatures that moved in coordinated swarms. Dan navigated the terrain with an ease that bordered on reckless, occasionally pointing out features with a casual air. "That there's a glow moss patch," Dan said, gesturing toward a cluster of neon green plants. "Looks pretty, but don't step on it. They explode." "Explode?" Veyrick echoed, his voice rising. "Yeah, but it's harmless as long as you don't stomp around like an idiot." The camp was a marvel of improvisation. It consisted of several interconnected structures made from scavenged metals and materials that seemed to be sourced locally. Solar panels and wind turbines provided power, while a small hydroponic garden thrived under artificial lights. "How is this possible?" Veyrick asked, marveling at the setup. Dan grinned, leaning against a makeshift workbench. "You'd be surprised what a bit of ingenuity and stubbornness can do. Humans are pretty good at making do with what we've got." Veyrick's sensors pinged again, this time detecting a massive lifeform approaching the camp. He tensed, his suit's defensive systems activating automatically. A creature emerged from the shadows, a towering predator with 6 muscular legs, gleaming fangs, and scales that shimmered like molten metal. Veyrick's appendages stiffened, his mind racing. The creature was larger than any predator recorded in the Federation's databases. "Oh, that's just Bessie," Dan said, tossing a chunk of meat toward the beast. The creature caught it mid-air, emitting a low growl of satisfaction before retreating to the edge of the camp. "You have tamed it?" Veyrick asked, incredulous. "Tamed? Nah," Dan replied. "We've got an understanding. I keep her fed and she doesn't eat me. Fair trade, right? Right?" Veyrick stared in disbelief. The human's approach to survival was utterly alien to him. Where the Evolians would build barriers and fortifications, this human seemed to thrive on mutual coexistence with the planet's dangers. Over the next several hours, Veyrick observed Dan as he went about his daily tasks. The human repaired a damaged rover, harvested volatile plants for food, and even crafted a makeshift explosive to clear a blocked path. Each action was performed with a mix of efficiency and nonchalance that left Veyrick both fascinated and horrified. "You adapt to this chaos so easily," Veyrick said during a break in Dan's activities. "Adapt or die," Dan replied with a shrug. "That's the Deathworlder way. Earth wasn't much easier, you know. Hurricanes, earthquakes, predators, you name it, we've faced it. But this," Veyrick gestured to the volatile landscape around them, "this is beyond comprehension. How can you remain so nonchalant?" Dan chuckled. "You'd be surprised what you can get used to. The trick is to stop worrying about what you can't control and focus on what you can." Veyrick recorded the conversation, his mind racing. The human's philosophy was as alien to him as the planet itself. Yet there was an undeniable logic to it, a resilience born from necessity, honed by generations of survival against insurmountable odds. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant rumble. Veyrick's sensors detected a massive thermal signature approaching rapidly. Dan stood, his expression shifting to one of alertness. "Firestorm's coming. Better bunker down." "A firestorm?" Veyrick asked, his appendages twitching nervously. "Yeah, it's like a sandstorm but with molten particles. Don't worry, the camp's shielded. Follow me." Veyrick hesitated before following Dan into a reinforced shelter. As the storm raged outside, he realized that while he had come to study this human, he might leave with a deeper understanding of survival and perhaps his own species' limitations. Veyrick's sensory appendages trembled as he replayed his initial interaction with Dan in his mind. The human's relaxed demeanor, his casual acceptance of this hostile environment, and his baffling disregard for what should have been overwhelming dangers unsettled the Evolian deeply. The concept of such resilience bordered on impossible by the standards of his people. He cataloged every moment meticulously, replaying the scene in his visor as Dan bustled around his camp, humming a tune. The camp itself was another enigma. It lacked the sterile efficiency Veyrick was accustomed to in Evolian engineering, but it was undeniably functional. Solar panels collected what little light pierced the dense, turbulent clouds. Wind turbines harnessed the constant gales, and the hydroponic garden thrived with plants that appeared wholly alien yet bizarrely familiar. This place was not the result of random survival, it was ingenuity born from necessity. As Dan knelt by a strange device, a conglomeration of wires, pipes, and glowing containers, Veyrick couldn't suppress his curiosity any longer. "What are you doing now?" he asked, stepping closer. Dan looked up, his easy smile returning. "Just fixing the converter. The water here's got all kinds of nasty stuff in it: sulfur, heavy metals, radioactive particles. If you don't filter it right, you're in for a bad time." Veyrick's visor blinked red, warning him of the dangers Dan described. "And you manage this without advanced technology? How do you even begin to design systems for conditions like these?" "Trial and error, mostly," Dan replied, tightening a bolt. "You blow a few things up, you patch them back together, and eventually you get something that works. Earth's got some pretty nasty environments too. Karak 5 is just a step up." Veyrick hesitated, processing the statement. The Evolians' entire civilization revolved around avoiding trial and error. Their every invention was meticulously planned, simulated, and tested in controlled environments. The idea of blowing things up to learn from failure was inconceivable. "And what if you fail irreparably?" Veyrick asked, his tone cautious. Dan shrugged. "Then you die, I guess. But hey, you don't grow if you're too scared to make mistakes." Veyrick fell silent, recording the human's words. His translator flagged them as nonsensical, but there was an undeniable logic beneath the absurdity. The faint rumble of distant thunder drew Veyrick's attention. His sensors picked up shifting atmospheric conditions, heat levels spiking, wind speeds increasing. Dan glanced at the horizon and frowned. "Looks like the storm's going to get worse. Stay close to the camp. You don't want to get caught in this." Veyrick's appendages curled inward. "The weather here is unpredictable." "Unpredictable? Nah, it's got a rhythm to it. You just have to know what to look for." Dan gestured toward the sky. "See those clouds? They're curling inward, which means the thermal updrafts are pushing the firestorm this way. We've got maybe an hour before it hits full force." Veyrick's visor analyzed the clouds but could not detect any clear patterns. To him, the storm was a chaotic mess of swirling gases and lightning. Yet Dan spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived here long enough to understand its language. "What will you do when the storm arrives?" Veyrick asked. Dan smirked. "Same thing I always do, ride it out. The shelter's built to handle worse than this." Veyrick followed Dan into the reinforced structure as the winds began to howl outside. The shelter was surprisingly spacious, filled with supplies, tools, and various trinkets that Veyrick could only assume were remnants of human ingenuity. A battered but functional generator hummed in one corner, its glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Dan grabbed a large metal container and set it on the central table. "Guess it's as good a time as any for lunch." Veyrick watched in fascination as Dan opened the container, revealing an assortment of sealed packages. He selected one, tore it open, and removed a block of dense, nutrient-rich material. "What is that?" Veyrick asked, leaning closer. "Ration bar," Dan replied, taking a bite. "High calorie, lots of protein. Not exactly gourmet, but it keeps you going." Veyrick's translator processed the composition of the bar and flagged it as incompatible with Evolian biology. He could only marvel at the human's ability to consume such dense, unrefined material without apparent harm. "You have adapted in ways I cannot comprehend," Veyrick said, his voice tinged with awe. "Your species thrives where others would perish." Dan chuckled between bites. "Thrive might be a strong word, but yeah, we're tough. Comes with the territory." As they sat in the shelter, the storm outside intensified. The sound of wind and crackling fire echoed through the walls, a constant reminder of the planet's hostility. Yet Dan remained unfazed, occasionally glancing at the storm with mild curiosity. Have you always lived here? Varric asked, breaking the silence. Nah, Dan replied, leaning back in his chair. I was part of an expedition about 10 years ago. We were sent to survey the place, gather data, maybe see if it was worth colonizing. Long story short, things went sideways and I ended up stuck here. Varric's eyes widened. You have been here for a decade? Alone? Dan nodded. Yep. At first I thought I wouldn't last a week. But you'd be surprised what you can do when you don't have a choice. Figured out how to make the camp livable, started exploring, and before I knew it, 10 years had gone by. And your species has not attempted to retrieve you? Dan shrugged. They might have tried. Hard to say. The comms went down early on, and I haven't been able to fix them. Either they wrote me off, or they can't get through the storms to reach me. Varric processed this information with difficulty. The idea of surviving alone on a planet like Karak 5 for so long was unfathomable. Yet Dan spoke of it with a calmness that bordered on indifference. How do you endure the isolation? Varric asked. Dan smiled faintly. You get used to it. Besides, it's not so bad. This planet's got a lot going on if you know where to look. And now I've got you to talk to, so that's a bonus. Varric was taken aback by the humans' resilience. His people would have crumbled under the weight of such adversity, yet Dan seemed to thrive in it. The storm outside began to subside, the howling winds giving way to a low, rumbling calm. Dan stood and stretched. Looks like it's clearing up. Want to see something cool? Varric hesitated but nodded. He followed Dan out of the shelter, his sensors scanning the area for residual hazards. The sky was still thick with ash and smoke, but a faint glow on the horizon caught his attention. Dan led him to a ridge overlooking a vast valley. Below, the landscape shimmered with bioluminescent plants and creatures, their lights dancing in the darkness like a living tapestry. Rivers of molten rock flowed through the valley, casting an eerie orange glow that illuminated the terrain. This, Dan said, spreading his arms, is why I stay. No matter how rough this place gets, it's got moments like this that make it all worth it. Varric was silent, overwhelmed by the beauty and danger intertwined in the scene before him. For the first time, he began to understand what drove Dan to endure. As the two stood on the ridge, the Evolian recorded every detail, not just for his mission, but for himself. In this human, he saw a reflection of something his people had lost, a raw, unyielding connection to existence itself, and he couldn't help but wonder what his own species might learn from it. Varric's systems were nearly overwhelmed as he stood beside Dan on the ridge, staring out over the surreal landscape. His 6 eyes tracked the interplay of light and shadow in the valley below, each glowing plant and creature cataloged by his visor. Despite the lingering heat from the firestorm, the environment seemed to hum with life. Rivers of lava twisted through jagged rock formations, emitting a heat signature so intense that even the Evolian's advanced filters struggled to compensate. Bioluminescent fungi and plants pulsed with faint, rhythmic light, as though breathing in tandem with the world itself. Dan's posture was relaxed as he leaned against a jagged rock, his gaze fixed on the scene. Varric, in contrast, was tense, his sensory appendages curled in apprehension. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was not a place for life to flourish, yet the evidence before him defied all logic. I've seen this view 100 times, Dan said, breaking the silence. Still takes my breath away. You'd think I'd get used to it, but nope. It's always a little different. Storms reshape the terrain, new plants spring up, old ones die off. It's like the planet's alive in a way I've never seen anywhere else. Varric's translator struggled to interpret the human sentiment. His people viewed planets as resources, materials to be mined, cataloged, and studied. To describe one as alive seemed overly sentimental and imprecise. Yet as he observed the constant movement and subtle changes in the valley, he began to understand what Dan meant. You have grown attached to this place, Varric said, his tone measured. Guess you could say that, Dan replied. It's dangerous, sure, but it's honest. Karak 5 doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. You either learn to work with it, or you don't make it. Varric's appendages twitched, as he considered the statement. The Evolians had spent millennia perfecting control over their environments. Their cities were masterpieces of precision and predictability, every variable accounted for. Yet here was a human thriving in the antithesis of that philosophy, a world where chaos reigned supreme. I do not understand how you reconcile the risk with the reward, Veyrick admitted. Dan glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's just how we're wired. Humans are stubborn. We like challenges. You see a death trap, I see a puzzle waiting to be solved. Veyrick recorded the statement, his processor flagging it as another example of human irrationality. Yet deep down he felt a flicker of admiration. The moment was interrupted by a sharp screech from the valley below. Veyrick's sensors immediately locked onto the source, a large, winged creature circling above the molten rivers. Its wings shimmered with iridescent hues, and its elongated form suggested both grace and lethality. Dan whistled softly. That's a fire drake. Beautiful, isn't it? Don't let it catch you out in the open, though. Those things can melt steel with their breath. Veyrick's appendages curled tighter as he analyzed the creature. It was larger than any avian species he had ever encountered, and its energy signature indicated a metabolic rate far beyond what should have been sustainable. How does such a being exist in these conditions? Veyrick asked. Same way everything else here does, Dan said with a grin. It adapts. Fire drakes use the heat to fuel their metabolism. They're predators, but they're also scavengers, smart too. I've seen one figure out how to open a sealed supply crate just by watching me mess with it. The thought of such intelligence in a creature native to this hostile world sent a shiver through Veyrick. His people's xenobiologists would have dismissed it as an anomaly, but here it seemed almost commonplace. As the fire drake disappeared into the distance, Dan pushed off the rock and stretched. Come on, I want to show you something else. Veyrick hesitated but followed. His suit's systems worked overtime to maintain equilibrium as they descended the ridge, the heat and radiation levels spiking with each step. Dan moved with practiced ease, navigating the treacherous terrain as though it were second nature. They reached a grove of strange, tree-like structures. Each one was composed of translucent, crystalline material that refracted light into a kaleidoscope of colors. Veyrick's sensors detected a steady hum of energy emanating from them. These are sun spires, Dan said, placing a hand on one of the crystalline trunks. They're a big part of why I'm still alive. The energy they give off isn't just light, it's got nutrients too. You can scrape off the crystals and process them into food. Tastes like chalk, but it works. Veyrick scanned the nearest sun spire, his visor displaying a flurry of chemical and biological data. The structures were unlike anything he had encountered, a perfect blend of organic and inorganic elements. Incredible, Veyrick murmured. This planet's ecosystem is more complex than I anticipated. Dan grinned. Told you. It's a death world, sure, but it's got its own kind of balance. Everything here is connected. You just have to look hard enough to see it. They spent the next hour exploring the grove, Dan explaining how he had learned to use the sun spires and other local resources to survive. Veyrick recorded every word, his mind racing with questions. How had humans evolved to be so adaptable? What could the Evolians learn from such resilience? As they returned to the camp, the sky began to darken. The faint hum of the sun spires faded, replaced by the distant rumble of another approaching storm. Dan glanced at the horizon and frowned. Looks like another one's rolling in. This one's bigger. Veyrick's sensors confirmed his assessment. The storm's energy signature was massive, and its trajectory would bring it directly over the camp. What do we do? Veyrick asked, his voice tight. Same as always, Dan said, his tone calm. Bunker down and ride it out. They hurried into the shelter, securing the entrance as the first gusts of wind battered the camp. The sound was deafening, a relentless roar punctuated by the occasional crack of lightning. Veyrick's visor dimmed automatically, shielding his eyes from the flashes of light outside. Inside, Dan moved with practiced efficiency, checking the generator and reinforcing the walls with additional braces. Veyrick watched, feeling both admiration and unease. This human had turned survival into an art form, yet the danger was palpable. As the storm raged, Veyrick found himself reflecting on his mission. He had come to Karak 5 expecting to study a primitive and likely doomed species. Instead, he had encountered a being who thrived where others would falter. Dan was more than an anomaly, he was a testament to the resilience of life itself. The storm lasted for hours, the shelter shaking under its fury. Yet Dan remained calm, occasionally checking the readings on a battered console. Veyrick marveled at his composure, wondering if he would ever feel such ease in the face of chaos. When the storm finally subsided, the silence was almost deafening. Dan opened the shelter's hatch, revealing a landscape transformed by the tempest. Trees had been uprooted, and the ground was scorched in places, but life persisted. "Another day, another storm," Dan said with a grin. Veyrick stepped outside, his sensors scanning the altered terrain. He had expected devastation, yet the resilience of this world and its human inhabitant continued to defy his understanding. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: hope. If life could thrive here, perhaps the Evolians had underestimated the strength of adaptation and the value of embracing uncertainty. As Dan began repairing the camp, Veyrick knew one thing for certain: his mission was no longer just about observation. It was about understanding a way of life that could reshape his people's perception of the universe.